Frankenstein, while not the first comedic take on Frankenstein or his monster, it's probably the best and definitely most well-known comedy surrounding Frankenstein's legacy. This version follows Victor's grandson, Frederick, played by the movie's co-writer, the late great Gene Wilder, who isn't a mad doctor held up in a castle, but a well-recognized professor at Johns Hopkins, and so embarrassed by his family's legacy that he altered his last name.
That's Frankenstein.
Frederick inherits the family castle and heads to Transylvania to take care of the estate, running into colorful characters along the way, including the grandson of Igor.
No, it's pronounced Igor.
But they told me it was Igor.
Well, they were wrong then, weren't they?
I mean, can we just agree that this is the best movie Mel Brooks ever made? Like, it's just the best. Not only is it hilarious and insanely quotable, but it is so damn loving to Frankenstein's legacy. Not only the Universal movies, to the point of using many of the same props in the lab, but the original novel, whose passages are quoted in more than once throughout the movie, and there's even this subtle reference to Prometheus.
You and I are going to make the greatest single contribution to science since the creation of fire!
It's just so loving. Brooks once said that you had to love the thing that you're parodying, and nowhere is that more evident than with this movie, turning the Frankenstein concept on its head in more ways than you might think. From the juxtaposition of everyone around Frederick wanting him to bring the dead back to life instead of calling it blasphemous, even the attitude towards his monster, who he does everything in his power to save and improve instead of abandoning and rejecting him. The monster, played by Peter Boyle, is probably the most successful attempt at a more childlike and naive monster that I've seen. Even the makeup, while similar in areas to Karloff's iconic look, is much rounder and innocent looking than the flat, stoic demeanor of Karloff's monster. This was another attempt to dance around Universal's copyright on the monster design. So if you ever wondered why the monster has a zipper on its neck instead of stitches, that's sort of why. But because of this more childlike approach, he never gets to any vengeful point because Frederick keeps coming to get him. And as far as I can tell, the monster never kills anyone. You could argue because murder isn't usually funny, but it adds a layer of empathy when all he's doing is running away and causing property damage instead of any bodily harm. This is also one of the few versions with a legit happy ending. Frederick gives the monster some of his intelligence and speaks not just his sorrows about how the villagers treated him just because of what he was, but how grateful he was that Frederick didn't give up on him and saw something in him no one else did. And in the end, it seems like the monster actually becomes a respected member of society. That's another thing about this movie that turns the Frankenstein story on its head. It's not about the regrets of hubris or alienation, but redemption. For Frederick and his family name, after he not only followed his grandfather's footsteps, but probably truly achieved what Victor set out to do, and for the monster who was given a chance at life and lived up to it. No longer dismissed, but accepted by loved ones. And as funny as this movie is, there's a lot more to it than that. But like I said, it was not the first comedic take on Frankenstein's monster. Frankenstein's monster is the lead character in the 1960s sitcom The Munsters, as the patriarch of a family of monsters. The monster, now called Herman Munster, played by Fred Gwynne, is married to Dracula's daughter and manages to live a normal 9-to-5 life, well, normal, with kids and a job at a funeral home. Herman's apparently been around since the mid-19th century and has done a lot of stuff since then, including apparently fighting in World War II. But because this is a silly sitcom from the 60s, there really isn't much in the ways of continuity or character development. Herman is mostly portrayed as a well-meaning, even-tempered family man who mostly causes collateral damage for the sake of slapstick, and there's not much of diving into his past or anything like that. There is, however, an episode where Herman meets his creator's great-grandson, Victor Frankenstein IV. Wow, this family isn't very creative with names. Maybe that's why Victor never gave one to Herman. And it just seems like that defying nature gene is really persistent in this bloodline, since Victor IV here made his own creature, Johann, also played by Fred Gwynne, who acts much more like the Universal monster, and Victor can apparently communicate with him telepathically? I don't know, let's just move on.
Her name is Dr. Carla Frankenstein.
Frankenstein? Funny, she doesn't look like a monster.
The story of Frankenstein is also the subject of an episode of Fantasy Island, where one of the people who comes to the magical, lesson-teaching wish fulfillment island is a doctor named Carla Frankenstein, played by Linda Day George, wanting to visit the island in an attempt to prove that Victor was just misunderstood in his methods, which is very debatable, but this video's long enough as it is. Though they're never quite clear on whether or not Victor Frankenstein actually existed, though it's heavily implied that he did. She does eventually come across the creature, played by William Smith, and dressed like he raided Sonny Bono's closet, but the makeup is pretty solid, so there is that. Once again, he is much more simple-minded, with no apparent resentment for his now long-gone creator, just despair and his inevitable loneliness in being outcast by society. There's also these guys who are apparently stalking Carla from a rival company who want to make him a sideshow freak for profit. They're stopped fairly easily, and Carla bonds with the monster, and while wishing to take him with her back home, Ricardo Montalban helps her see that he would be just as shunned now as he was all those years ago.
My dear doctor, this is not the world of make-believe. We are dealing with real life.
I haven't got the heart to tell her.
But she promises to come back to the island so she can stay with him more often and he'll be less alone. In the meantime, he gets to have dinner with Ricardo Montalban, so happy ending all around.
It's magic, Dr. Frankenstein. No. Not magic. It's science.
I was surprised to learn that Victor Frankenstein is a reoccurring character on Once Upon a Time, played by David Anders. Given that the show is about well-known Disney characters being placed in the real world under a curse, Frankenstein seemed like an odd inclusion, but not an unwelcome one. Because of the aforementioned curse, the storybook characters are living in the real world under different identities. Until the second season, Dr. Frankenstein is the town's main physician, Dr. Whale, a distinct reference to the director of the 1931 movie, James Whale. There's a lot of stuff in this show with him under the curse, but here we're just gonna focus on the mad scientist stuff. Once the curse, well, the first curse anyway, is lifted, we learn how Victor fits into this world. Victor doesn't come from a world of magic like most of the others seem to, but a world ruled by the laws of science, or the land without color. Say what you want about this show, but I love that. Anyway, like his book counterpart, Victor sought to defy those laws of science, but unlike his book counterpart, he eventually needed magic to accomplish his goal of bringing the dead back to life. And while Victor was attempting these experiments anyway, what made him go a step further to truly accomplish that goal was his brother, Gerhardt, who is not named after either of Victor's brothers from the book. Come on, you could have finally given Ernest some love. Anyway, he wanted to bring him back to life after he was killed when trying to stop Victor from grave robbing. So he made a deal with one of the show's main antagonists, and from the few episodes I've seen, the best character in the whole damn show, Rumpelstiltskin. I'm not gonna go too deep into the deal itself, but Victor may have inadvertently created the means for the evil queen to be evil. Oopsie. You do get the sense with this Victor of someone who constantly persists to make his experiments work despite failure after failure, of a stubborn genius who insists he knows what he's doing. He does eventually bring his brother back, but of course, he's a shell of his former self. Much like the typical grunting, simple-minded monster prone to outrage, even killing their father for yelling at Victor. Gerhardt has fits of distraught when he realizes he's getting too aggressive and monstrous. It really gets across the deep sadness at not knowing himself anymore. Too bad this doesn't go anywhere. Yeah, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I can tell, Victor leaves Gerhardt in a tower, promises he'll fix him, and that's it. He's never seen again. I don't know if the curse separated them before something could be done or what, but it really is a shame that this never seems to be resolved in a meaningful way. But Victor actually gets some development after the curse is lifted. He tries to make things up to the evil queen by bringing her dead fiancé back to life, which goes about as well as you'd expect, and then goes into a drunken stupor and refuses to help patients because he only makes things worse. A point that I'm very surprised the book version never got to, frankly. It's an overall interesting interpretation of Victor's ambitions and his downfall, if for no other reason than being able to summarize Victor Frankenstein's entire legacy in one line.
I wanted my name to stand for life. But everybody just thinks it's the name of a monster.
From what I can tell, there's not much from Dr. Whale's life as Dr. Frankenstein after these focus episodes, but it's kind of cool to see a version where Victor does see the error of his ways and improves from them. And eventually, he bleaches his hair, becomes best buddies with Dr. Jekyll, and teaches science at the local high school. So that's nice. Happily ever after and all that jazz. Now let's switch things to another medium.
You are free that I bear your curse, torn from my grave to appease your desires.
Just to clarify to you all, this is indeed a real thing that existed. Though if you are a fan of musical theater, you know that obscure musicals based on public domain horror icons are hardly rare. But would you believe that it was this strange, short-lived musical that first sparked my interest in the original novel? Yeah, Frankenstein, a new musical, is actually a really solid adaptation. Some things aren't changed, of course, but one thing this really fixes is the pacing problem a lot of adaptations have. The musical format allows for very strong and complicated emotions to be felt in a really compressed amount of time without feeling rushed.
I'll understand every scene because they'll sing what they mean instead of making a face.
Victor was played by Hunter Foster, who was not only really the best choice for a musical Victor you could have found, but one of the most accurate interpretations of the character I have ever seen. Or, heard. The haunting music accompanied by his vocals really emphasizes Victor's struggle and strife, from his frustration at no one seeing his vision of life after death, to his ongoing guilt and grief at abandoning his experiment and the pain his creation caused, to his loneliness and pursuit to right his wrongs in the end. It works. This applies to the creature as well, played by Steve Blankard. Here he's just a big hulking guy, not even with much scarring or deformity. I assume this is because the production was off Broadway and kind of on the cheap side, but the performance, at least judging from the cast album, more than makes up for it. Blankard plays the creature in his glorious, agonizing, melodramatic self, playing up every complicated emotion to the highest dramatic height right before it could get silly. What's also kind of sweet about this version is that it's one of the very few out there where Frankenstein and his creation actually reconcile. Victor apologizes for his actions right before he dies in the Arctic, and the creature mourns him and the events that led them to that icy demise. I could see some people taking issue with it, but I thought it was a really strong change. The soundtrack for Frankenstein: A New Musical is easily available, and I cannot recommend it enough. It may have only run off Broadway for about 3 weeks, but it's a strong enough adaptation to make me realize how grand the original story was and encourage me to read it for myself. And any adaptation that can do that gets a ton of extra bonus points. But if it's so good, why didn't it run longer? Well, there's always a lot of factors to something like this, but the most popular theory is that there was another musical opening that gave them some competition.
If you're blue and you don't know where to go to, why don't you go where fashion sits?
Again, yes, this exists. After the success of the producers, Mel Brooks, with almost the exact same creative team, brought the iconic Young Frankenstein to the Great White Way, and opened within days of Frankenstein: A New Musical. Yes, if you thought it was bizarre to have one Frankenstein musical, there was a time when there were two. The reception wasn't nearly as strong as it was for the producers, and it only ran for about a year, but it's actually a pretty solid reimagining. It's still just as silly and loving as the original, though I will admit it took me a while to get used to seeing Young Frankenstein images in color. Frederick was played by Roger Bart, who you may recognize from the producers, and stayed with the show through its entire run. I always felt Roger Bart was an underrated theater performer, and this performance is an excellent example of why. No one can replace Gene Wilder, and he doesn't try to. Bart has an untold amount of energy on stage, and brings that to this role with a livelier version of Frederick that still manages to stay the straight man. And Schuler Hensley is the monster again, with somehow less lines, yet more personality than he had in Van Helsing. Hensley also stuck around for the entire run, which is great, because he was probably the only person out there who could have pulled off the putting on the Ritz bit for the Broadway stage. There are certain plot points moved around, but not much changes in terms of character motivation or personality. There is, however, a dream sequence with Victor Frankenstein himself pressuring Frederick to join the family business in a song that is just the best damn song.
Join the family business, rob a grave or two, stop the shop from closing, it all depends on you.
This version also has, in my opinion, a much more satisfying ending. In the movie, I always felt the end was a bit abrupt, but in the musical, the monster actually saves Frederick's life after the villagers hang him, essentially bringing him back to life. It's both very clever and very funny. It just feels like things come full circle, you know? Okay, we've had our fun, but now we're really gonna get into it.
You're Detective O'Connor.
How did you get in here?
I go where I want. In 200 years, I've learned a lot about locks.
This is one of those Frankenstein's monsters survive until the modern day stories, which is actually an idea I really like. And even with that great idea, it is staggeringly boring. This is a crime drama about two detectives investigating a series of murders, and they aren't the only ones on the case. The creature is played by Vincent Perez and goes by the name Deucalion. Get it? Deucalion? The son of Prometheus? It may seem a bit on the nose, but it's certainly one of the more creative names I've heard for the creature. But the makeup is pretty lackluster. Outside of one scar on the side of his face, he just looks like a regular guy. But he does have other scars on his body that glow when he's electrocuted. Okay. We honestly don't learn much about Deucalion at all in this movie. He just kind of shows up to give our lead detective some cryptic clues. He doesn't even have a part to play in the climax, which really sucks. But he does have a mission in this movie to stop the murders caused by Victor Frankenstein, played by Thomas Kretschmann. Yep, Victor is still around, and no, this isn't the story of Frankenstein taking place in the modern day. This is telling us that both Victor and his creation have somehow survived for the last 200 years. And look, the creature I can buy easily. He's almost superhuman in some aspects. But Victor? How is this possible? We never find out. But Victor is apparently a well-respected member of society, a surgeon going by the name Victor Helios, and Deucalion isn't the only one of Victor's creations running around. A lot of them live right in New Orleans, and eventually he intends to repopulate the entire world with his creations, because evil. One of these creations is posing as his wife, and when she doesn't fit his exact requirements of perfection, he destroys her and rebuilds her. He's just generally a creep. This is the only version in this video giving Peter Cushing some competition for most evil Frankenstein. The movie plays with the idea of having Victor as a true villain, with Deucalion being a hero intent on stopping him. How he hasn't managed to do that yet is anyone's guess, but maybe it has something to do with Victor's freaky H.R. Geiger spine.
There is something on your back.
Seriously, what is this? What am I looking at? No one notices it. We never see it again. This is just a thing that happened. A lot of the what in this movie is a bit clearer when you realize it was actually meant to be a pilot for a full series. Originally a collaborative project between the USA Network and author Dean Koontz. But due to creative differences, Dean Koontz left the project and the show was never picked up, which is probably for the best. Most of the characters are ridiculously boring with half-delivered performances. Every shot looks like the camera was coated in dirt, which I hate, and there are just too many questions left in the air for this to stand on its own. Never mind engage people enough to want to learn more. Dean Koontz would go on to adapt this concept into a series of 5 novels, which I haven't read, but they're pretty well acclaimed, and there are talks to adapt the books themselves, so maybe there is hope for this concept yet. But let's be honest, we all know there's only one way to truly bring Frankenstein's monster into the modern day.
I, descender of the demon horde. I, my father's son. I, Frankenstein.
Yikes. Well, we certainly saved the most disappointing for last. I, Frankenstein is about the creature being recruited, sort of, by an army of gargoyles who are working to defeat a legion of demons who are after the creature because he holds the secret to reanimating the dead, and they want to use him to reanimate hundreds of corpses that will be possessed by demons. And if this plan sounds like a big fat ripoff of the plot to Van Helsing, that's because it is. And once again,
not a great plan.
On the surface, this seems like a really dumb premise, but when you dig into it, it's even dumber. But I'm going to try to prevent tangents on this movie as a whole and just focus on the creature, or Adam as he's called by the leader of the gargoyles, played by Aaron Eckhart. No longer a deformed sin against nature, but instead a sexy edgelord with sexy scars instead of unnatural ones, and a chiseled six-pack that the camera focuses on way too much. Not that I'm necessarily complaining.
Dead. It's the new sexy.
How is it The Dark Knight made Aaron Eckhart look more like the creature? Well, okay, Adam may not look the part at all, but this can be saved with a good story. But from the brief synopsis I gave, you can probably guess we don't get that. Adam is, once again, a tool. Even though this movie is called I, Frankenstein, it seems like Adam just gets dumped into the plot of a completely different movie 5 minutes in. Most of this movie is about the gargoyles and demons fighting over Adam, with Adam just waltzing around in the background like a jackass. And when they do focus on Adam, it's all over the place. The gargoyle leader, whose name I can't be bothered to look up again, Lenore, I think? Anyway, tries to sympathize with Adam in a way, sharing the sentiment that just because he wasn't born from man doesn't mean his life doesn't have value. This is a good idea. Maybe have Adam continue his search to figure out what life means for him, with her acting as an occasional spirit guide or something? Nah, that's dumb. Let's just stick Adam in the mountains for the next 200 years until we need him for the demon story again. And on top of that, have her completely lose faith in his potential to have a soul after he accidentally causes one human to die while killing many of their enemies. There could be a great conversation to be had, but man, is it not being had here. Honestly, despite its ridiculous premise, I was actually kind of intrigued by this idea when I first heard about it. There's a lot you could do with Frankenstein's creature surviving until the present day. But there is no point to this being in the present day. Modern society doesn't affect the story at all, and besides the gargoyles and demons, Adam interacts with one other person. That's it. And as far as Adam himself goes, he may be the flimsiest part. They try to give him some conflict with bringing up his hatred for Victor, and credit where credit is due, the opening actually has a nice moment of Adam bringing Victor to his family grave to be buried. It's a good bookend to the book's original ending. But then the movie gives him that closure again when he burns Victor's notes on him. But not only is this redundant, but what any of this has to do with Adam's supposed arc in this movie is anyone's guess. Adam's arc is apparently learning to care for someone besides himself, even though he has no reason to because the gargoyles have been awful to him despite how he's helped them, and he's known Tara for like half a day. And with that in mind, there's nothing to suggest in this movie that he isn't noble. Like I said, he took the time to bring Victor to a proper resting place, he fought enemies in a war he has no agency in and was really just dragged into, and continues to do so when these supposed agents of God are complete jerks to him. The final battle ends with the demons being conquered and Adam realizing that he does have a soul. And at this point, I can't remember why I'm supposed to care. Because any attempt to actually say something in between action scenes in this movie is hollow and meaningless. You might think it's weird that this is the one getting me worked up. After all, look at this poster. This was doomed to fail from the start. But I like the idea of Frankenstein's creature wandering around as a kind of shadowy vigilante in modern day. There is so much you can do with that. Heck, even the idea of having agents of heaven and hell could have worked. But every step this movie takes to attempt to do something cool with this premise, it stumbles over and falls right on its own ass. So what can we take away from all of this? Well, certainly this story isn't going anywhere. Despite some adaptations that just don't get it, Frankenstein has stayed in the public consciousness for the last 200 years because it is such a deep, intriguing concept that was fleshed out into something thought-provoking and emotionally charged. And it shows no signs of slowing down. There were, of course, a bunch of versions out there that I didn't get to cover here, and assuming that the Universal Dark Universe isn't completely dead yet, we might be seeing him again sooner rather than later. A remake of Bride of Frankenstein was supposed to be the next movie in line in that universe, with Javier Bardem as the monster, who is honestly not a bad choice. But after the phenomenal failure of The Mummy, it's probably best if Universal takes some time to figure out how to make this work before rushing that movie out. But trust me, nothing would make me happier if a Frankenstein movie was the one to turn that universe around. But until the next time Dr. Frankenstein defies God again, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you had a happy Halloween, and I will see you guys next time.